In the town where houses kept their secrets like seeds, a small sound divided the morning. Not a cry, not quite a whisper, but a breath that had learned to make do. A man left a cardboard parcel at the shelter's gate, folded his coat over his hands, and had the look of someone who had sold the last of his kindness. Inside the parcel, something slept with the steady rhythm of patience that comes from knowing how to wait. The shelter had rules and schedules and tidy rooms where clocks measured worth by time and space. The parcel did not belong in any room. It was labeled simply problem. The word landed like a pebble in a pond and rippled into mouths and the arithmetic of capacity. People who worked there had faces that softened for a moment and then hardened, like bread crusts. For shelter is a place that must be practical about mercy. Yet where pity was counted, there was also a different sort of keeping, the counting of eyes and small, stubborn miracles. The parcel moved along the slow river of hands, and the story inclined toward a choice no one expected. That mattered. Elias had the habit of talking to the sunlight. He did not mean to be theatrical. It was simply that the light came through at exactly one seat in his small kitchen, and the world there seemed to answer back. He was a man who had learned the ledger of loss in close arithmetic, a wife who had gone in slow stages, a son who had drifted into cities that answered with lights but never returned with a voice. The house kept the names of people like marks on a map, the chair that had been refused to throw out, the teacup with the hairline crack, the scarf folded as if someone might still need its warmth. He kept his grief like a calendar, private days, small observances, things checked off and then rechecked because the mind sometimes hoped a ritual would mend the shape of an absence. A few potted things claimed the windowsill as a small rebellion. A geranium whose leaves tilted toward the day as if gossiping with the glass. A sprig of rosemary that smelled like the sea because memory will not be satisfied by fiction, and an old stubborn ivy that crept where it pleased. He called them company and talked to them with a soft, slightly ridiculous affection. They answered by staying alive, which was sometimes the only generosity the world allowed him. The rosemary, in particular, was a stubborn soldier, a small, fragrant insistence that things could grow even when hands forgot exactly when to water them. He tended it with a careful habit, a pinch of soil here, a trim there, as one tends the last little useful rituals that anchor a life. He had been a teller of small stories in his youth, a repairer of things. Now he kept the library neat and the kettle ready. The town knew him as the man who shopped for extra bread when other people were short, who left notes and then kept the notes folded in a drawer. He volunteered 2 mornings a week at the animal shelter because he liked the movement there, things coming and going, the honest business of hands and mouths and small, impatient lives. It was an arrangement that fit the hurt and the ordinariness of his days. He could measure usefulness in concrete actions, and usefulness steadied him. The shelter itself was a building with its own grammar. It spoke in rust and disinfectant, in the quick snap names called across rooms, and in the soft padding of feet at night. The staff were people whose faces had softened and hardened in the same day so many times they bore both looks like a coin. There were rules, of course. Lists, capacity charts, the pragmatic arithmetic of mouths to feed and cages to clean. And there was the parcel day. The mornings when overnight arrivals were catalogued with the tenderness of someone sorting through old letters and the ruthlessness of someone who must make room for what is most urgent. On one of those mornings, the parcel arrived like an apology. It was not the sort of parcel that belonged to any of the usual stories. It came wrapped in stale newspaper, the kind that kept words but lost heat. Someone had tucked it with a hand that had forgotten names and had left it with a note that said little. Problem. The volunteers stood in a slack semicircle around it, because even among people accustomed to small cruelties there is a reluctance to look at shame and call it by name. The parcel smelled faintly of rain and old breath. It asked nothing and, perhaps for that reason, attracted all manner of projection. Elias found himself part of that circle mainly because he liked to see what others tried not to name. He knelt and peered without wanting to intrude, because one learns from the plants that small acts of attention can alter outcomes. The parcel shifted. A sound, not a yowl, more a breathing that had learned to be close to the ground, answered. Then a small movement, deliberate and slow, like a thing checking itself after a long sleep. Those who had been there longer made quick decisions and wrote down boxes in neat ink. But Elias had spent his life listening for the beat beneath the notation. He noticed a paw. It came through a gap in the paper with the curiosity of a hand testing the edge of a book. The paw had a way of arrhythmia about it, a patience and cunning both. It pushed forward, felt the air, withdrew, and then reached again. He watched the pattern as he might watch a seed that would not be fooled by the frost. He had never understood the business of judging worth on the shape of a body. He watched behavior, as he had with the rosemary that kept offering its small scent even when the stems went thin. Behavior, he thought, is a truer scripture than appearance. "Disabled," said the head volunteer. The word fell flat and clinical in the warm room. People nodded as if to a weather report. They had sheets, their charts, the boxes that held decisions. The parcel's breathing was steady. The paw tapped once more, insistent as someone knocking on an old door. It was an image as plain and stubborn as the ivy that would take a brick and make from it a new world. Elias's hands remembered the simple kindnesses. How to cup a kettle that was too hot. How to fold cloth without making a noise. They moved before he thought, and his fingers slipped through the newspaper to touch the edge of the small body. The fur was coarser than the advertisements promised and warmer than the paper had promised. The creature within leaned into the warmth like a map folding in the right way. It sniffed his knuckles with a learned economy, the kind of being that conserved strength and gave affection in small, tidy currency. It did not demand spectacle. It offered small, faithful accounting. What made the room change was not the condition that had been written in indifferent ink, but the sort of eye that met him through the paper. Not looking like a pet in any catalog, it nevertheless looked as though it had counted on someone to keep exact watch. That it had kept the watch itself until Bones learned thrift and breath became a small ceremony. There was a softness in the look that was not pleading, but a quiet demand. "Notice me if you are the kind who notices the unasked for." Elias felt, with the slow astonishment of habit interrupted, that the creature had read more of his life than he had assumed. He had a habit of giving names to things that would not speak otherwise. He said nothing at the time. Names are sacred and should not be thrust upon the unready, but inside a syllable turned as if it had been waiting for a voice. Out of the corner of the room walked a young girl, a junior volunteer who had learned the shelter's ways and the young steadiness of people who mend. She bent and lifted the parcel with the gentleness one affords a small misdemeanor. Her fingers lingered where his had been, and for a moment there was a shared ledger between them. Hands that had done what was necessary, hands that felt the pull of something unnecessary and bright. "He's not in any pain," she said, but the sentence was less a report than a prayer. "He's just awkward. They said they couldn't keep him. It's a space thing. They said he might be better somewhere else." Elias did not respond with plan or protest. He thought of the ivy on his sill and of his wife's habit of saving a little broth in a cup in case something needed it. He thought of the way the rosemary had insisted on being tended even when the stems went thin. The world, he had learned, often waits for the small stubbornness of one person. He found himself standing and offering what he had always kept in reserve, a small unadvertised mercy. "Can I take him home for a while?" he asked, and the words came out in the tone of a man who had practiced yeses for smaller things. There were processes. There were forms to be signed, a sticker to be placed in a ledger. The young volunteer's eyes shone with an understanding older than the paper that labeled the parcel. The head volunteer hesitated on principle and policy, but saw something in Elias that would not be served by strictness that day. A hand stamped a line and another shook on a decision that would change the map of two small lives. The shelter's door closed behind him with the little finality of an unkind, careful world. The walk home was the sort of small pilgrimage that marks the beginning of new debts. The town's pavements knew Elias by the way he carried his life, quiet and deliberate. Now he walked with a parcel beneath his arm as though it were a tribute he had been given, and could not refuse. People nodded. The butcher, the baker, the woman who sold newspapers. Each offered the civil smallness of a world that keeps its face composed when the map changes. No one asked because some mysteries are granted by proximity rather than inquiry. Some turns in the street are acknowledged only by quiet assent. At his door he paused and set the parcel down on the welcome mat as though it might need a moment to recover from the journey. The ivy leaned a tendril toward it as if curious. The geranium made no show, but its leaves tilted. He wiped his palms on his trousers and found himself saying a small, awkward thing to the parcel, which was the only language he had at hand. "Come in, then," he murmured. "Come and see the light." He opened the parcel in the kitchen where the chair still had the indentation of another person. The cat, for he now called it cat in the quiet way names become true by use rather than ceremony, emerged with deliberate motions. It did not leap or run. It tested the floor, pressed each paw in turn as if making a map of his new territory. One hind leg moved with a different rhythm, a syllable missing from a familiar word. It arranged itself with a small gravity at the foot of his shoes and sniffed the hem of his trousers as if cataloging the man who had chosen him. Elias watched the cat watch the room. He had seen animals before and had the old quiet belief that to notice behavior is to learn language. The cat's way was to look, to wait, to ask nothing louder than a flick of an ear. When he reached to lift it, the cat did not fling itself into his arms. Instead, it wound around his calf in a motion suggesting both gratitude and practical negotiation, and then sat with the dignity of someone who had been traveling for a long time. He arranged a small bed by the radiator, an old towel, folded like an offering. The cat explored the bed with the attentive pride of a creature that keeps its own counsel. It washed one forepaw with a flick that was almost a ceremony, and then rested its head on the towel. Elias prepared a small saucer of broth, and the cat ate with measured bites, tasting the room as a traveler tastes a stop along the road. If the house had had a sound before, it had been the soft tick of clocks and the hum of an oven. With the cat in it, the house changed its breathing pattern. The rosemary, which had unfolded its thin leaves like constellations since his wife's last hands had tended it, scented the air, and he found himself talking in the half-voice one reserves for funerals and births. He told the cat simple things: where the kettle was, where the sun came in properly, where the chair left the right space for a pair of legs. The cat listened as if these were important maps. That first night they slept in a mutual arrangement that is often the beginning of small loyalties. He put the kettle on for a water that he would not drink, leaving the house's other half as an offering. The cat settled on the towel and breathed in that steady, patient rhythm. Elias woke once and felt the press of something small against his ankle, grounding him. He had not expected such insistence from something that had been called a problem. Days made habits as they always do. He found to his surprise that his hands moved faster when there was another being to feed by them. He cleared his table with an economy learned from the rosemary's patience, and the newspaper folded in a place that might be called tidy. He started bringing the cat to the window at noon so it could watch the sparrows. The cat's head followed with the earnest attention of a scholar, and sometimes, in a sudden flurry, it would attempt to hop, to reach a sill and then come back down with the careful negotiation of someone who had learned to measure what is possible. People came by. Some knew him, and some knew only of houses and stories. A neighbor who once had a dog that belonged to 3 generations, an old acquaintance from his workdays, a child who liked to count chairs, all brought their small astonishments and left. Each time someone asked about the cat, Elias would say the same thing: "He is mine for now." The phrase sat like an amen and became truer each time he repeated it. There were nights when the house missed the heavier footfalls of the past. He would sit by the window and think of the way his wife's fingers had once scraped the scum off a pan, the small domestic heroics he had once taken for granted. The rosemary's scent would rise and remind him of soup and the exact weight of salt. In such moments, the cat would approach as if testing the edge of grief, laying a paw on his knee or simply sitting where a lap had been. Its touch was not a cure. It was the simpler miracle of company that asks nothing more than to be present. He found himself arranging small rituals around the plant's needs, as if the ivy and geranium were complicit in some larger recovery. He would tuck a leaf back when the ivy strayed, speaking soft admonitions that belonged more to cohabitation than to order. In tending the plants he tended himself. They required attention that would not invade, that small space between care and possession. And the cat, patient as all good teachers of the lonely, taught him the economy of steady presence. As his ordinary world shifted, small things from the shelter threaded in like a seam. The young volunteer's handwriting was on a card now tucked behind a photograph of a younger Elias and his wife. The shelter's note about vaccination and a name given by bureaucratic habit sat on the mantel, and yet meant less than the way the cat turned its head when called. The town's gossip named the cat the awkward one, and then softened to the brave one in the way that wells of affection deepen when they are fed. Then, As if the universe required a formal punctuation, the inciting incident arrived not as thunder but as a letter. It came from the shelter with neat, efficient script and said in its way what the parcel had implied. There had been complaints. Space was tight. Some animals demanded resources that the shelter could not always afford. They asked if Elias would consider fostering permanently. The sentence folded into him like a question he had already been living. He sat with the letter and the cat that night. The ivy leaned toward the lamplight and the rosemary purred in scent. The cat pushed its head against the paper as if to lay claim to the newly named possibility, as if it could sense the ledger of decisions and place its paw upon it with quiet insistence. Elias understood with the slow revelation of one who has had to relearn a language that his life had been altered. He was not simply a man who tended. He was becoming the kind of person who would be kept by another heart. He had stepped over the threshold of his ordinary days and onto a path where compassion would be a map rather than an occasional act. The parcel had been left at a gate. The parcel had been called a problem. The inciting incident, the decision to bring this small creature into his home and life, was now a formal thing, written and asked for, and it made the rules of his days different. In the soft light, the rosemary's tips caught like small bright promises. The cat, who had been called awkward and labeled in ink, curled and settled as if to claim the place. The world rearranged itself by the quiet fact that someone had chosen to notice. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. The town kept its evenings tidy, as if regret were a thing that could be swept under carpets and locked away in cupboards. But the small disturbances of kindness are not tidy. They are porous. When Elias took the cat into the house, it began to unmake tidy things in the gentlest fashion. A paw at a curtain, a furred shadow that would not follow the ledger. In the weeks that followed, the parcel's label, problem, was replaced by other names that fit the creature better. Companion, witness, small conspirator. Yet the world that needed tidy things does not always forgive interruption. Complaints have the slow hunger of weather. They begin as whisper and age into policy. In that change, the town discovered its own arithmetic. A neighbor's letter, a council clerk's quiet smile, the shelter's sudden request. Little by little, the invisible scales tipped. This is the hour when loyalties begin to cost coin and attention, when a life kept because it is worth keeping begins to ask for more than gratitude. It is the hour when Elias must learn whether the small, stubborn thing that curled against his leg has the capacity to ask in the way that changes the map of a man's days. The town's calculus had awakened, and so, in quiet escalation, had a decision that would not be undone. The cat, who Elias had begun to call by the private name of Hob, a single syllable that seemed to suit both gait and mood, settled into the rhythms of the house as if he had been its missing word. There was a portion of the morning when sun fell like a warm coin across the kitchen table. Hob would claim that sunlight with a dignity that made Elias laugh softly, a sound that startled him by how rare it had been. He found with a modest astonishment that his days arranged themselves around small agreements. The cat's feeding times, the watering of rosemary, the pause at the window to see how sparrows fared. In that domestic order, Elias felt mended in the incremental way that gardens mend stone. The town, always inclined to make a story out of any soft thing, began to watch. Mrs. Lark from the next terrace, a widow with a ledger of grievances, noticed Hobbs' tendency to forage beyond the mat and wrote a note that read more like an accusation than a neighborly admonition. The letter was polite in its phrasing. The ink betrayed a sharpened edge. It arrived folded across Elias's doorstep like an invoice. Stray animals, health concerns, municipal rules. Elias felt the paper in his hand like a small injunction. He sat with it on the table, the rosemary scenting the room into a kind of memory that would not be cruel. How small an accusation must be, he told Hob, whose ears twitched as if he understood the arithmetic of complaint. The cat's good temper gave nothing away. He padded through life as if his body were making a point about dignity. Yet the town's laws had sharper teeth than any feline grace. A municipal notice came soon after, written in the dry, careful hand of people who keep their hearts in banks and their rules on ledgers. Please note, it said, community standards require registration for unowned animals. Repeated complaints may lead to collection. Elias, who had once been a man of small certainties, felt his chest learn a new metric: indignation divided by capacity. He could not, by inclination or thrift, fight every fight the town proposed. His pension was not a river, but a steady trickle. There were days when he balanced payments like an ancient acrobat. The idea of a fight that asked for money, signatures, appearances at council rooms that smelled of dust and formality, pressed upon him with a weight that was less physical than procedural. Yet the thought of handing Hob back to a system that had called him a problem made his throat close in a way that reminded him of grief. The shelter, for its part, sent no such council letter. They had been kind at first, pragmatic and uneven. Their decisions had been to allow Elias the foster period and to trust for a little while in human decency. But they had their own pressures: calls from donors, capacity charts that creaked like old timetables, the perpetual arithmetic of mouths to feed. An unforeseen call came one midweek afternoon from Susan, the junior volunteer who had first lifted the parcel. There were more urgent intakes, she said, and they were being candid and necessary. Could he keep Hob long-term? The question arrived less like a favor and more like an indictment. It marked an escalated expectation: the shelter's need to balance hearts and cages. Elias took the question to the rosemary and to the ivy. He sat in the kitchen that evening with the letter from the council in one hand and the shelter's call transcribed in his head. Hob wound around his ankles as if offering a small physical vote. To keep Hob would be to accept a strain he had not anticipated. To return him would be to live with the particular ache that follows an act of retraction. He tasted both choices, and they were bitter in different ways. Complications grew not only in the paperwork but in the private ledger of life. One morning a boy, the son he had not seen in years, and appeared at his gate. Jonah had a face like the weather, changeable and with an inclination to rain. He had been away in a city that taught men to be cleverer than kind. He had heard through the soft rumor of his mother's friends and the brittle gossip of telephone wires that his father had taken in a cat. He came with a packet of reasons wrapped as if for an inspection: work, a small man's thin patience for compromise, obligations that the city imposes like fees. Jonah's hands had learned to fold and bargain with life. Elias greeted Jonah with a tea that had gone more to ritual than warmth in recent years. The cat watched the son with the interest of a diplomat, testing moods as if they were spiced wine. Jonah's voice was clipped with the city's hard edges. He did not understand the rosemary or the ritual of watering, but he knew the arithmetic of space and the calculation of appearances. He had come, Elias suspected, partly out of curiosity, and partly because the town's whisper had found an old map in his memory. "You can't keep all the things, Dad," Jonah said after a while, not unkind but resigned. "You can't keep this and that, it's complicated." He gestured broadly, encompassing the house, the plants, the cat, the absence of the woman who had been part of their earlier map. Elias felt a flame of something like grief and something like stubbornness in equal parts. He asked Jonah carefully what he thought of Hob. Jonah reached out and patted the cat's head with a lack of ceremony that made Elias laugh, a brief, surprised sound. "It's a good cat," Jonah said. "He's calm." Then he added, as if tasting the political economy of filial duty, "But you need to be careful. Rules are rules. It doesn't take much for Mrs. Lark to write another letter." The son left with a mind that had been briefly softened, but the town's gears turned without hesitation. Letters accumulated in Elias's mailbox like small weather reports. One was a demand from the council insisting on registration. Another was an unsigned note that read, "We are watching." The shelter's polite calls became more frequent, their hinterlands of need growing like vines. There was a pressure in the air that belonged to institutions, the kind of pressure that is not cruel so much as inexorable. Elias took Hob to the vet for a checkup, believing that practical measures might soothe the formal edges. The vet, a woman with hands as steady as a priest, examined the cat with a seriousness that made Elias respect the animal anew. "He's older than you think," she said gently, "and the injury to the leg is old, not recent." She pressed one paw and the cat closed its eyes and accepted the handling with that patient dignity that had become his signature. There were no miraculous cures. There was the kind of care that stitched small things into a life. The vet suggested a modest brace, special food, a daily routine that would help his mobility. The bill, itemized and clean, arrived like a quiet undertow. Money became a tight companion. Elias sold a few things: a lamp his wife had once loved, a set of old plates with the sort of history that made selling them a small grief, and paid the vet. Jonah, whom grief had taught to be practical, offered to help with the paperwork for registration and to come by now and then. There was a moment when Elias felt the world bend toward him in a way that was gentler than he expected. People, he found, would show up when invited by quiet need, yet no one could stop the town's logic from seeking to correct its own perceived disorder. A notice arrived one wet afternoon. A neighbor had formally complained again, and the council had responded. A preliminary collection notice. If unresolved, the animal would be collected and rehoused elsewhere. Elias read the words as if they were something that had landed upon his chest. He felt the rosemary scent sharp and bitter in the room, as if even the plant understood a battle about to be made. At the midpoint of these pressures, Elias found himself walking Hob to the small park, where the cat sat like a miniature sovereign on a bench and watched world affairs with the unruffled contempt of the wise. Small children, who always recognized the sweet of need and simplicity in animals, approached and stroked the cat. A girl named Maisie, who liked the town's pigeons more than its rules, asked him, "Does he wait for you when you're away?" Elias smiled. "He waits for me," he said. The girl nodded with the certitude of truth. "Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to? Do you believe cats know when we're at our lowest?" The question hung in the air like a bird and touched more than the moment. For it is the patience of animals, a waiting that is neither complaint nor expectation, that uncovers tender things within us we had forgotten. That evening, as he sat with the letter in his palm like a small stone, Elias noticed the cat had been troubled. Hob paced the floor in a way Elias had not seen since the day he first arrived from the parcel. He watched quietly as the cat sat at the window and stared into the lane. Something in Hob's gaze was attentive to a rhythm beyond the house. He pressed his forehead to the cool window and saw what Hob had seen. Footsteps down the lane, measured and purposeful. The coming of someone who walked with purpose and who had the look of someone accustomed to making claims. The knock at the door came when the lamplight was low, and the house smelled of broth and rosemary. Elias opened to find a man in a uniform. Not a ruffian, but a clerk of the town's legal apparatus with a badge and a form folded like a small obligation. Behind him stood a van whose logo read, in the careful fonts of municipal necessity, Animal Control, and beside the van, a silhouette that made Elias's chest descend into an unfamiliar hollow. The head volunteer from the shelter, whose eyes held an expression Elias could not readily name. "We received another complaint. Mr. Ashby," the volunteer said with the politeness of people who practice denials as an art. "We've been asked to collect stray animals that have become a nuisance." The words came as if from a script, but the pause before the last sentence carried an extra weight. The clerk held out a form that declared an intention to collect and transport Hob for rehousing. His voice softened like a hand seeking a wallet. "It will be temporary, sir," he said. "We only do what the council directs." Elias had been preparing for letters, for forms, for small battles. He had not been preparing for a door to be knocked and for the shelter, the place that had first entrusted the cat to him, to stand with the town's apparatus in a way that felt like betrayal. The volunteer's expression wavered between regret and duty. Hob sat behind him, watching with the same face as always, undramatic, attentive, as if the moment were a small testable detail in a longer story. "What do you mean, temporary?" Elias managed, though the word refused to be small in his mouth. He looked to Jonah, who had come just at the sound of the knock and who now stood in the doorway like a man who had been called into harbor with no map. The son's face, usually so cautious, now showed an emotion that resembled old love and old exasperation in equal parts. The volunteer tried to explain. There had been a new directive. The council was clearing streets. Animals without full registration and stable ownership were to be collected. There was, he added, a miscommunication at the shelter. They had to prioritize those they deemed most at risk. The words folded in upon themselves with the special sterility of bureaucratic kindness. Elias felt something like steam rise in him and then to condense into a firm resolve. He refused to hand over the cat like a thing at the end of a ledger. He had kept Hob not because he had a rhetorical devotion to animals, but because in doing so, he had been made more human. "I signed the paperwork," the volunteer said. "There are limits to what we can do." His eyes briefly confessed complication, funds, space, the shelter's own precarious economy. Elias saw in that look how systems tie hands and ask hearts to bend. Jonah stepped forward then, his voice finally soft enough to chip a stone.
"My father has given this cat a home," he said.
"He is registered where he needed. If there's an error, we can fix it now. Don't take him yet." The man with the form rustled paper like a small defense. He said apologetically that the forms had been filed in a way that he could not easily reverse without a supervisor's clearance. The volunteer turned his head and, for a breath, looked at Hob in a way that made Elias think of the first moment at the shelter when hands had lifted the parcel. There was an acknowledgement there, but it did not extend to defiance of procedure. The clerk opened the van's side and the interior smelled of rubber and the tang of disinfectant. It was not an environment for a creature with the cat's soft dignities. Hob looked at the open van as if it were a story about to be read. Then he looked at Elias. His eyes were entirely without blame. They were only intent in small inquiry. Elias felt his limbs choose the lawless thing they had been born to perform. "No," he said, a word small and final. It was the sort of word that throws its weight against a current. The clerk's hand hovered. The volunteer's smile thinned into something tremulous. Jonah's jaw clenched, and in that moment the son and father shared an unspoken compact. To resist, if resistance was what the moment required. But resistance in a world of forms must be done with papers and names. And Elias had not come prepared with the right stamps of authority. He had only the paper from the council that demanded he register, the shelter's earlier consent, and a stubbornness that does not always win against rules. He could promise to sign, to pay a small fine, to bring any necessary documents to the municipal office, but the clerk, bound by instructions and a supervisor's oversight, could not accept promises at face value. The volunteer moved as if to consult, and the breath of time, the crucial seconds when a decision is still reversible, began to narrow. It was in that folding moment that Hob did something none of them expected. He walked forward, each step deliberate, and left the safety of Elias's doorway. He climbed into the van as if entering a carriage in which he had made a claim, sat by the open door, and looked at the men in uniform with a calm so profound it broke something in their practiced motions. The clerk, who had expected to carry a thing by force, found himself speaking instead in an altered tone. He opened his mouth and closed it again. The volunteer placed his hands on the van's rim, and for a second the world seemed to hang on the cat's even breathing. Elias reached for Hob as if to pull him back into the familiar geometry of their home. But Hob refused the rescue in a way that astonished them all. He sat in the van and extended a paw toward the clerk, tapping lightly on the metal as if to say, not in complaint but in counsel, "Do not make a haste of this." The gesture made silence of the men's training. For a moment the van was simply a vessel and the cat its small, sure captain. "You can't take him while we're talking," Jonah insisted, his voice a mix of fear and assertion. The clerk's hand lifted uncertainly. The volunteer's face, which had expected a simple transaction, softened into something messier. Conscience. In that softening, the last of the procedural imperatives stuttered. But procedure is like tide, predictable and unstoppable if you watch long enough. A radio chattered in the clerk's pocket about a prioritization call from headquarters. The volunteer's phone buzzed with messages. The forms once inked had a stubbornness of their own. The man in the uniform took a step back and then forward, and the van's side door began to slide closed with a sound that was like the last hinge of inevitability. Elias lunged, the movement less heroic than it was urgent, and his hand found the van's frame. The world thinned to the small circle of their contact. Hob looked at him as if measuring how much of a life could be counted, and then, with a small, astonishing grace, slid out of the van, not into Elias's arms, but into the clerk's. The clerk, stiff and official, froze under the cat's soft weight and then, as if unanchored, bent and slid the cat onto his shoulder. In that absurd and tender tableau, a man trained in systems was caught in the gentleness of a thing he had been trained to remove. The silence broke as if something had been struck. The volunteer's voice full of sudden human pleading. "Wait." Outside, thunder moved on the edge of the town like the drumming of a distant judge. Inside, the cat sat like a small oracle, balanced on a uniformed shoulder, and the men who had come to enforce the town's neatness found themselves measured by a creature that asked nothing but attention. Elias felt the world tilt between what was official and what was humane. He had a decision to make, and whatever he chose would be the turning point he had been circling since the parcel had arrived. To fight with the forms and risk losing his peace, or to give in and let the institutional machinery do what it had been designed to do. He saw with the clarity of a man who now understood the ledger of his heart that some acts bind us in a way that cannot be reversed by a stamp. Then the phone in the volunteer's pocket buzzed with a message that turned the color of the day. An anonymous donor had offered funds to the shelter if they prioritized certain intakes, animals with potential for rehabilitation or adoption. The words on the volunteer's screen were a kind of arithmetic that rearranged the shelter's choices. The man with the badge looked at the phone, at the cat on his shoulder, and at Elias in a sequence that felt like an argument made of small mercies. He checked his radio and listened to an instruction that moved like a hand through water. The decision, which had seemed inevitable, now hung upon the breath of other people's intentions. Elias felt, with a tenderness that surprised him, that the cat had made its own appeal. Hob had stepped into the world's machinery and shown it the small, stubborn nobility that belongs to animals who do not know how to plead other than by being. The volunteer who had once left the parcel at the shelter's gate, with the unadorned confession of a busy life, wiped his eyes in a way that made Elias see how the shelter had been both an apparatus of mercy and of attrition. The clerk closed the van's door halfway, and the rain began to fall in serious stitches that made the lane shine. For a moment the town's rules stood on the brink of being rearranged by the gentler instruments of human sentiment. Then another sound slid into the scene. The sharp administrative voice of a phone call from headquarters insisting on process. The clerk's shoulders tightened. The volunteer's message went unanswered. At that second, just as the wave that might have turned toward mercy seemed within grasp, a new shadow moved at the end of the lane, a figure in the shape of an authority, bringing with him a piece of paper that would change the equation entirely. The volunteer's phone lit with a name that made his face fall. The clerk's hand tightened on the van's handle. Jonah's jaw set as if preparing for a final, irrevocable motion. Elias looked at Hob, who sat with the same quiet dignity, and realized that the turning point had arrived, the moment of no return where choices made in human hearts would be pressed against the hard edge of law and economy. He reached without thinking toward the van, toward the shadow, toward whatever would be next, and in that reaching the story poised like a bird on a wire, waiting for the strike. Outside, the rain washed the lane clean of yesterday's dust. Inside, the cat looked at Elias as if to say now. The world, which had been counting and balancing, prepared to make the next move. The van door's edge caught the light like a blade. The first drop of a decision fell. Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to? Do you believe cats know when we're at our lowest? Share your quiet moments below. They are the small laws that change the maps of our lives. The volunteer's phone pinged again. He read the message and his face went pale. The name on the screen belonged to a man from the municipal office, and the words he spoke into the rain were small and terrible. They want him back. They say he's not just a stray. They say he's registered with the town as property. The van's side door began to close. Rain has a way of speaking in small languages. It tells you how quickly roofs can run thin, how footprints fade, how the town's polite decisions soften into mud. On the lane outside Elias's house, the rain made a hush that could be mistaken for mercy, and in that hush the van hummed like a reluctant hymn. Men in uniforms have the businesslike patience of clocks. They are patient because they are waiting to be permitted to be precise. Tonight the rain made them precise and the precision made them hard. Elias's breath came in a measured rhythm under the lamplight, a rhythm matched by Hob's even old cat breathing. The parcel that had been called problem months ago now sat between them like an accusation the town could not entirely wash away. People had gathered, neighbors with umbrellas and faces softened by small loyalties. Jonah stood by his father like a shard of a forgotten map trying to be useful again. The shelter volunteer's hands trembled with a duty that felt too heavy for his frames. The clerk's presence smelled of rubber and forms. Hob sat on the van's step as if on a small stage, the rain making his fur dark and solemn. The moment held like a bell, willfulness against rules, tenderness against procedure. Elias felt the old marrow ache and the new courage rise. He did not yet know whether law or love would win, only that the next words would decide everything. The world narrowed to wet footsteps and the small, loud rhythm of a ticking mind. Elias's palms were damp. His heart performed a curious arithmetic in which every small act was worth more than any signed line. The volunteer, the young woman who had first lifted the parcel, kept glancing at him as if to measure whether the man who had spoken softly days ago could now be loud enough to be believed. The clerk adjusted his cap and waited for an instruction that was not forthcoming. Jonah's face had the look of someone who was learning how to stand again. Elias moved forward as if to speak, but before his mouth shaped a word, the man in the uniform took out a small device and ran it over Hobbs' neck. The machine clicked like an older clock finding a groove. A beep answered, the sort of tiny, bureaucratic sound that turns attention into evidence. The clerk squinted at the readout and then tapped a screen. The rain pattered, filling the silence with a rhythm that read as punctuation. When the chip scans, the clerk said, we record the last registered owner. It's procedure. He read the small print from the screen with the professional detachment of someone who reads signs and loses nothing in emotion. Owner, Margaret Ashby. Last registered address, 12 Willow Lane. Status, registered property. Notes probate pending. The words landed like a stone into Elias's chest. The ivy at his window would have known the sound, a small sharp thing hitting earth with a claim. For a moment nothing else existed. The volunteer's hand covered her mouth. Jonah's face went pale as paper left in rain. Elias felt the world pivot on a familiar axis. The name of his wife, Margaret, appeared in the town's small ledger of ownership. Margaret had died years ago. 1,000 small memories pooled in his eyes at once. Her hands combing rosemary into a pot of broth, the sound of her contralto humming when rain came in. He tasted salt that was not entirely rain. That can't be right, the volunteer said. But the clerk only held up the device and another paper that he had fetched from the van, a printed transcript of the municipal registry. It's in the system, he said, voice even. Property registered under Margaret Ashby. Probate listed, but the property, personal property, is under municipal hold pending case review. The town has the right to inventory unclaimed assets. Elias's breath moved through his shoulders like a measured bell. His life had been measured by little observances. In one of them there had been a name he had loved and trusted to papers and to later care. He was not a man practiced in sudden argument, but grief had taught him a steely kindness, to hold what one loved with a fierceness that refused to be polite. She would have wanted him kept, he said. His voice, when it came, was small but not without steel. She would have put down the name if there had been any chance. Jonah's jaw worked. He had a manner of being practical that sometimes mistook tenderness for weakness. Now tenderness answered with a resolve. If it's our name there, he said, we can prove it. There must be paperwork from her will, or the solicitor's file. If it's in probate, it's evidence she meant it. He looked at Elias with the kind of quick hope that belongs to sons who have come home to be useful. The volunteer, caught between duty and compassion, fumbled in his pocket and produced a small envelope. Inside was a yellowed receipt, the kind of paper that time softens into memory. He held it out. We found this in the shelter files and from when you first came to take him, he said. It mentions a name. We didn't have the tools to connect it. It was filed under intake. But the chip is definitive. Elias took the paper as if it were a relic. The handwriting on it had something of his wife's slanted loops in it, a curl here, an insistence there. He let his thumb rest on the ink until the black blurred under his finger like a small tide. He thought he would tremble. Instead, his hands were steady in a way that frightened him with its necessity. Proof was a medicine he had not expected to need. The volunteer had been on the brink of tears and orders in equal measure. He swallowed. If you have documents, Mr. Ashby, you can present them to the municipal office and we can halt collection pending review. Sometimes the registry is updated in error. We can... His voice unraveled into official hope. Elias saw an opening as small and tender as Rosemary's new shoot. He gathered himself and said, I will bring what is needed. I will. He stopped, thinking concretely for the first time in days. I will go to the solicitor. I will show probate papers, but not now. Not while the van is open. That sentence was less a plan than a plea. The clerk consulted his radio and listened to a line of voices that sounded like the distant ticking of other people's commitments. In the van's interior, Hob blinked at the men as if they were making a play of laws that were somehow separate from the law of comfort. He rubbed his head along the metal edge and looked at Elias with the steady gaze of ones who know what they are owed. This was the moment the town waited for, the hinge between ordinance and mercy. Elias stepped closer to the van and spoke with the cadence of someone who had learned that small things can be made into promises. "If you must inventory," he said, "let it be here where I can see. Do not take him until we have the chance to show what papers there are." His words were not an appeal to compassion alone. They were an appeal to the small justice that exists in seeing, in being witnessed. The clerk's shoulders hunched, the radio hissing a line of orders. The volunteer who smelled faintly of disinfectant and old bread spoke. "We can arrange that. There's a provisional hold if you can produce proof of ownership or a valid claim." His eyes were wet in the corners with the memory of a time when policies were softer. He reached to close the van's door but paused, held by the collective breath of the crowd. For a brief, luminous half-minute the town stood on its hinge. Neighbors edged closer under umbrellas. Mrs. Lark's face had softened, and she had an expression like a woman looking at something she once thought herself too old to know. The rosemary on Elias's sill seemed to uncoil in the memory of wind. Jonah turned to his father with the kind of resolve that is not taught but inherited. "Come on," he said. "We'll fetch the papers. The solicitor is tonight." Elias realized that the scaffold of his life, the small routines and the unremarked kindnesses, had become a public thing, a map everyone was reading now. He felt both embarrassed and proud. He moved to the door with Jonah at his side and reached for Hob. But before his fingers could close around the cat, the van's side door slid a fraction, and a man in a dark coat emerged, carrying a folder stamped with the municipal crest. The newcomer had the air of someone who had been used to being obeyed. He introduced himself with the barest of courtesies. "Municipal attorney," he said, and he read a strip of paper like a verse. "I have an order," he said. "Seizure of property under Municipal Ordinance 14B, unclaimed. Personal property and probate or neglected assets may be inventoried and assigned to municipal care pending disposition." Elias felt the words as if they were winter cold. The municipal attorney's papers were official in a way that breathed an authority outside the little kindnesses of neighbors. The volunteer looked at the attorney with a sorrowful politeness. His eyes swallowed their hope. Jonah's face was the color of rain-washed paper. "Margaret Ashby is my mother's name," Jonah said, with the small, taut hope of someone reading their own map in another's hand. The attorney read his papers again, skimming with the professional disinterest that made decisions look like weather reports. "According to our registry," he said, "this animal's registration is under the estate in probate. However, the estate is currently subject to a claim, and until that claim is resolved, the property is under municipal hold." "You can't seize a living thing," Elias protested, his voice cracking like an old string. "She left him to be cared for. She left instructions." "The registry shows probate pending, Mr. Ashby," the attorney said, and his tone was not unkind. "We have obligations." It was possible to hear law as the sort of machinery that does not like to be hurried by feeling. Elias felt the machinery grinding. He thought of the parcel at the shelter's gate, the way someone had labeled Hob a problem in the neat cruelty of that small script. He thought of the rosemary, of the house's tatters, of the wide, subtle kindness his wife had left in her small acts. There was a choice now that required more than papers. For a man like Elias, there was always the option to obey the rules and let systems make wounds where hands might have healed them. But he had been chosen by a living being who made his mornings warmer and his nights less lonely. Those were not matters for mere probate. Jonah, who had been younger in years and older in the quickness of his decisions, glanced over at their neighbors. An old man from 2 houses down had taken off his hat and placed it upon his heart. A woman who once complained of cats had wiped her face. The town had gathered into a quiet jury. Elias stepped forward and made a decision that surprised even himself. He reached up and unlatched the van's small step and put his hand on Hob's back. The cat did not resist. It pressed against his palm like a small, living creed. Elias felt a fierce tenderness that made his voice clear as a bell. "This is home," he said. "Do what your laws must, but not while it is being worn by cruelty." I claim what she meant. His hands experienced a small, monumental resolve. The municipal attorney looked at him as if assessing a variable he had not accounted for. He checked his papers and then, in a way that made the rain seem irrelevant, he declared, "You may present evidence in person at the municipal clerk's office in 1 hour. Until then, we will not transfer, but we must inventory and list and perhaps place the animal in temporary municipal custody, if it's required." He tapped his papers where a rubber stamp waited like a judge. Relief came like a spotted bird. Jonah exhaled, fingers unclenching. The volunteer pressed his fist to his chest like someone saying a prayer. He had not been sure he still believed. Elias felt the rosemary scent like an old blessing. And yet among the relief there was a new, quiet terror. Proof would have to be found and presented, and the hour to secure it would be a race not against speed but against paperwork, signatures, and the caprice of offices that close with the sun. They agreed on terms that were small and technical. The cat would remain with Elias until the clerk's office verified documents. No removal would take place until then. The clerk made a notation and the attorney stamped a line with cold ritual. The van's presence receded like a tide. The men in uniforms folded themselves into the rain and drove away with a lowering of their eyebrows that suggested the town had not been conquered, only moved. As the van left, a hush descended. Not the empty hush one gets in rooms after a death, but the uncommon hush of something that has been nearly lost and preserved. Elias held Hob close as the rain eased. Jonah placed a hand on his father's shoulder with an odd new intimacy. The volunteer lingered, and for a moment the three men bowed their heads in a manner one might reserve for funerals and births. They had 1 hour. They rushed now, not as if speed were the measure, but as if clarity were. Jonah offered to run to the solicitor's office, a place of papers and small promises, while Elias took the yellowed receipt and the volunteer produced a note that had been filed at the shelter's intake. Found at 12 Willow Lane, Margaret. Ashby's note attached. The volunteer's hands shook as if paper were heavier than iron. The receipt was a thin thing and the signature on it nearly illegible with time, but in its looping script there was something of Margaret's small insistence, a manner he knew in the tilt of a teacup. They moved as if the whole town's pulse depended on the rapidity of practical tenderness. Jonah sprinted down to the solicitor's office, shoes slapping wet pavement. Elias went to their small desk and opened drawers he had kept closed for years. He found the lawyer's file, the folded envelopes that contained the last will he could just barely remember signing in a friendlier world. His hands unsteady, he pulled out a brittle page and read, "In case of my absence, Hob is to be kept and cared for by Elias Ashby." The words were small and ensured of themselves like a compass. Proof, at last, but not without an urgency that turned the stomach. He dialed the municipal line as Jonah returned with the solicitor in tow, an older woman with a hairnet of gray and a competence that smelled faintly of wood polish and tea. She had been the keeper of their small legal world when Margaret first wrote such things. Her eyes were kind and precise. She verified the document with a stamp, and the municipality's phone line crackled with the sound of formalities being rearranged. The municipal office, when called, said it would hold its decision until verification. The attorney's voice when it answered was not unkind. He said he would suspend transfer pending the clerk's confirmation. There was a pause, the sort of pause that contains both promise and warning. Documents had been produced. Proof of intention existed. The small current of law shifted toward the human. Elias thought he would breathe. He had not counted on the small late arrival of a new variable. A car drawn up at the end of the lane with 2 men inside who had the quiet look of people with power and a certain social weight. A note on the windshield read, "From Pembroke & Co." Mr. Pembroke was a man of influence in the borough, one whose name carried with it the shuddering weight of old money and new demands. He strode up the lane as if the pavement were doing him the courtesy of honoring his steps. When Pembroke approached, he carried with him 3 things: a smile that had 0 warmth, a file thicker than the municipal papers, and the kind of gaze that sizes up small lives in the blink of an eye. "I understand there is a dispute over an animal," he said, voice smooth as varnish. He opened his file as if unfolding the town itself, and pulled out a document stamped in the kind of official ink that is hard to argue against. "This animal is listed in our records as municipal property previously claimed under Section 9A for property transferred to public ownership during the last census of unclaimed assets. The town assigned ownership to Pembroke & Co. for the purposes of sheltering and managing such assets." The words were a rainstorm of a different sort. The municipal attorney stiffened. The volunteer's face went slack. Jonah's eyes flashed with something like rage. Elias's bones felt the old chill, the one that arrives when systems take a human interior and make it code. You can't just claim a living creature as property, Jonah blurted. Pembroke smiled with a politeness that carried a threat. By law, sometimes we can, he said. Especially when probate is unfinished and when private parties have offered to manage the inventory for the public good. Elias held Hob to his chest as if the cat could be a shield or a token of truth. The plants in his window, which had borne witness to this life's small ceremonies, trembled in sympathy. He realized then that the battle was not just for one animal, but for the meaning of small kindness in a town that preferred tidy accounts. Pembroke's file was a muscle that could compress the town's tenderness into an accounting ledger's neatness. The municipal attorney leafed through Pembroke's pages with the caution of a man reading an old map whose legend was complicated by new ink. He spoke in a low voice into his radio and then looked up. There may be a conflict, he said. We will need to convene a hearing. The thunder overhead seemed to answer with an ominous cadence. Elias felt the hours slip like sand. He had produced proof that his late wife had meant Hob to be kept, but Pembroke's claim raised a new question. Had the town years ago assigned certain unclaimed items to private institutions? Had Hob, in the tangled bureaucracy of death and inventory, been swept into a ledger no one had kept them from? The legal field was a brambled thing, and he was an old man trying to run through it. As they stood in the rain, the volunteer's phone piped a new message. He read it and went very still. The message was short. Urgent call from council. The timing was bad. The rain poured as if to underline the sense of an omen. The volunteer's face paled. He mouthed something to Elias that was lost in the patter. The municipal attorney turned to Pembroke and then to Elias. Given the conflict, he said, we must place a formal hold and convene the hearing within 72 hours to resolve the matter. Until then, the animal will be listed as disputed property and must be held pending the decision. Elias felt the ground he had claimed as a man slip. The hearing would mean a delay that could stretch time into wake. He had imagined proving his wife's intention would be enough. Instead, the law introduced another ledger, another hand. He thought of the shelter's parcel labeled problem. The town's machines had turned that word into law. Pembroke smiled and offered a hand that smelled faintly of cigars and ledger ink. We will be cooperative, he said, but the law must be followed. His tone carried the compacted certainty of those who have never had to ask for mercy. Jonah's fists curled. Elias's voice came like a small bell. We will fight, he said. Not with your money, Mr. Pembroke, but with truth. The men in suits had the polite smile of people who have always had others argue the truth for them. They did not notice how a town's heart can be moved by the quiet insistence of neighbors. They did not yet know the number of small hands that would appear for one old man and his cat. For a moment, the story poised. Elias looked at Hob, who blinked and yawned in the rain as if weary of being a lever. Hob blinked at him with the sort of repose that contains a fable. The cat had no use for legal metaphors. His life was a matter of lapse in sun, and a man who kept the kettle warm. Elias felt in that small domestic faith the shape of his choice. He had already chosen to keep Hob in his life when no one else would. Now he must choose how loudly his choice would be heard. He straightened, rain clinging to his coat like small grief, and spoke to their gathered neighbors in a voice steady with the kind of grief that becomes a moral instrument. He told them of Margaret's small rituals, of the rosemary and the way she had left things in order where possible. He spoke of the parcel's arrival, of the young volunteer who had lifted it, and of the shelter's halting kindness. He spoke of how Hob waited at the door and of the way a cat's presence can make a house remember itself. One by one, hands were raised. Neighbors who had once been quiet came forward with stories of small kindnesses the cat had given them. A comfort on a stolen evening, a warm presence that sat with a child through a fever, the gentle way Hob had not judged a man for weeping on his porch. Words like these are small laws. They have a gravity that does not appear in files. The murmurs turned to a chorus. Pembroke's smile fixed a fraction. The municipal attorney glanced at his papers and then at the swelling crowd. The rain seemed for once to understand that people who have been bound by grief will stand for one another. The municipal attorney tapped his radio, and a voice answered, Council has received your report. They will convene, but the hearing cannot be cancelled. It must proceed in 72 hours. Elias felt the seconds purring like an engine in his chest. The battle had been escalated into a formal theater where rules and tenderness would meet. He had been moved into being, a man who would stand before authorities and plead for something that might be called small, but which, to him, contained the weight of a life. He had made his choice. He would stay and face the hearing. He would not run away with Hob to some far field where old men might try and fail to hide from law. He had decided that longevity without witness is not living. He wanted his fight to be seen and to be argued in open air. He looked at the faces of those around him and found in their eyes enough courage to know a better future might be built on this small stand. As the rain lessened to a hush and the van's taillights faded into the lane's wet reflection, Elias realized they had crossed a line. This was no longer a private care. It had become a public case, a story that the town would retell at kitchen tables and in the shelter's narrow rooms. He felt the weight of that and the thinness of his clothes against the rain. But for the first time since his wife died, he felt something else, a readiness to be more than the quiet man he had been. He looked down at Hob, who blinked a slow, unbothered blink that seemed both to approve and to instruct. Elias touched his head, the small, reassuring press of a promise. Around him, the townspeople closed in like a slow, loyal tide. There was fear, yes. There was also a budding fury that gave a shape to the word community. He thought for a sliver of a moment of what the failing of this fight would mean. To lose Hob would be to lose more of himself than he had ever thought possible. He thought of Margaret's handwriting on brittle paper and the courage it took her to write a name. He thought of the rosemary, of the ivy, of small, stubborn growth. He felt something like mercy bloom in his chest. They would have their hearing. They would bring their papers and their neighbors. They would stand before law and plead for the right of an old man and his cat to be kept together. Elias felt the world narrow to the single truthful thing he intended to say when the hearing convened. This is not property. This is life. He had reached the turning point. He had chosen. The next hours would be a jury of forms, of voices, of people who might decide whether a town measures its worth by its ledgers or by the heat it keeps beneath the roof. Would you stay, if you were in their place? The municipal attorney's phone buzzed once more. He checked the message and read the words that made everyone's breath catch. A terse dispatch from the mayor's office. The mayor was to attend the hearing personally, and with him came a representative from Pembroke and Comer who carried a sealed affidavit and a request for immediate transfer of disputed assets. The sheet was stamped with the borough's crest in 3 small words that sounded, when read aloud, like the clack of a judge's gavel: immediate municipal claim. The van's taillights disappeared into the rain. The lane fell quiet as if waiting for the sound of the first bell at war. When the rain had done its small, honest work, washing lamplight into oil-slick ribbons and making the lane look like a mirror for worn shoes, the town found itself arranged around a single question. What does one do when law and kindness speak different tongues? The van had retreated like a tide that had tasted shore and pulled back, but its passage left prints in soft mud, and a promise that the parish would soon be called to account. Elias stood in the doorway with Hob held like a coin of weight, Jonah at his elbow with a face rewired by purpose, and the neighbors gathered like an audience that had been given a new play to perform. It is a strange thing, a small animal making a community remember itself. The rosemary on Elias's sill scented the air with home, the ivy leaned as if to hear better, and the cat, quiet and sovereign, blinked at the rain and at the men who had kept records and called themselves guardians. The hour that followed was not dramatic in the old loud way of storms. It was dramatic in the soft, inexorable manner of vines reclaiming brick. Papers would be read. Voices would rise and fall. In the spaces between, something older than ordinance, the small law of neighborliness, prepared its case. They had 72 hours, and time is a peculiar thing. It is both a measurement and a moral test. In that slender allotment, Elias discovered how much the town could be marshaled by small certainties. He found, too, how the rhythm of his days had altered beneath the cat's even breathing. He rose each morning earlier than before, not from the wrench of alarm, but from the soft urgency of purpose. The kettle sang its first precise note, and Hob threaded between his ankles a ribbon of warmth in the chilly light. Jonah became, in those days, a visible engine. He called old acquaintances from the city, Men who kept offices and files and the sort of influence that smells of tannin and late lunches, and asked favors that had been dormant. He did not ask for money. He asked for presents. "Bring your names," he told them, "for this is a matter of our town's conscience." The son's voice, which had been trained in compromise, found in the fight a kind of quiet righteousness that surprised him as much as it comforted his father. Neighbors gathered in careful increments. Mrs. Lark, who had written first in complaint, now sat with a damp handkerchief and an expression that was not quite apology, but was its near cousin. She had seen Hob on rainy evenings curl against the porch of her neighbor, and had noticed with a small shame the ease with which the animal offered a listening companionship that her own house sometimes lacked. She had come to offer a statement of good behavior, and to confess how a cat had been, in fact, a small counselor to her when her own son had stopped writing letters. The shelter volunteer, Susan, organized a list of witnesses and first-hand accounts. She kept a notebook with tidy entries. Found December 3rd, 20. Behavior, patient, observant. Interaction with neighborhood, calming. Medical, Brace suggested. Paid. She offered what evidence she could from intake forms and the letter that had accompanied the parcel when Hob had first been abandoned in the shelter's care. Her hands shook when she handed over the yellowed receipt Elias had later found. There was an intimacy in paper that made one feel less alone. "We didn't know what to do," she confessed to Elias once at his kitchen table. "We chose what seemed easiest then. We are sorry we could not fight your corner sooner." The plants in Elias's window, not oblivious to human performance, became a small chorus. The rosemary scent went through the house like an old hymn, convincing the air that good things could persist. The ivy, which had once crept in quiet rebellion, now seemed to press its leaves toward the doorway as if to witness the comings and goings. People noticed such things, because when law sits in judgment, even small acts acquire the gravity of symbolism. A town that saved its roses saves its memory, and towns that neglect their fragrant things forget what they once knew about tenderness. Pembroke and Cosiern, however, was a different sort of tide. Their offices smelled of old paper, and the patient certainty of men trained to translate life into account ledgers. Their representative, Pembroke himself, if rumor was faithful, did not retreat. He sent assistants who arrived with chests of documents, affidavits, copies of 19th century censuses that had been dusted and read like gospel, to find any clause that could support the transfer of Hob's status to private stewardship. They claimed municipal assignments, and they claimed to act for the public good. Their rhetoric was a smooth varnish over a claim that looked like commerce. Yet the town is not merely a collection of ledgers. It is an organism made of small, repeated mercies. A petition went around the lane, started by the woman who ran the bakery and signed by hands that had once only tutted at strays. They wrote with ordinary pens and strong hearts. "This man and this cat have been neighbors. This animal has served our children and comforted our lonely." The petition read less like a legal document than like a prayer, but in the end prayers are sometimes what forms law, because law, after all, rests upon the consent of the governed. They took strategy. The municipal hearing, scheduled as a formality in the council chamber, was to be the arena where papers would speak and hearts could be evidenced. Elias found himself rehearsing in his head, not legal phrases but small truths, Margaret's handwriting, the Rosemary's witness, Hob's patient watching at the window, the ways small acts remended a man's days. He would not speak to a judge's code. He would speak to a community's conscience. Jonah found allies in unlikely places. A local teacher, Mr. Delaney, offered to compile testimony from the children in his class, who had been consoled by Hob during a week of high fevers and the slow horrors of family fractures. Children remember differently, the teacher said. They keep precise records of tenderness. Parents sent statements of how Hob had waited at porches for returning teenagers, how he had crawled into the lap of a widow at the bus stop and made her sit while the world resolved itself somewhere else. These were not exhibits of property claim, so much as proof of belonging. The shelter, for its part, performed a modest but crucial act. Their director, an elderly woman with a pragmatic tenderness, publicly stated the chain of events that had led to Hob's arrival and subsequent foster. She read from the intake sheet. Found abandoned. Note attached. Condition: disabled. Recommendation: foster rehab. She admitted the shelter's error in sending a collection vehicle to the lane without clearer communication and promised, in a statement that smelled faintly of disinfectant and contrition to support Elias's claim. This kind of admission is rare. It is a small institutional humility that is often the seed of reform. Yet paperwork has teeth. Pembroke's counsel produced a file that was a Gordian knot of ownership claims. They argued that the town had, on a census year, declared certain unclaimed animals as municipal hold and arranged for private management. They introduced affidavits from other neighborhoods where similar transfers had occurred. Their speech was an orchestra of legal rhetoric, and it was difficult to oppose the cadence of the well-practiced. In the quiet hours, Elias sat with Hob, on his knees, and felt the cat's heartbeat, a small, unargumentative drum. He had to temper his rage not with loudness but with the harder instrument of document gathering. He and Jonah sorted through drawers, found more of Margaret's notes, called the solicitor, and compiled affidavits. The solicitor, Mrs. Brandt, typed and mailed a formal petition declaring that Margaret had explicitly designated Hob as a bequest to Elias in her will. The town law, she explained with that ultimate clarity of those who have read pages until their eyes are sharp, required proper probate acknowledgement and citizen testimony. They provided both. The day of the hearing came with a sky that pretended indifference. The council chamber was a small place, its chairs arranged in rows that suggested formality. The mayor sat at his elevated seat with an air of duty, and Pembroke and Co.'s representatives took their places with the ease of the accustomed. Neighbors filled the room. The baker with flour still beneath her nails, the teacher with a folder of children's drawings depicting Hob as a small saint, Susan the volunteer with intake papers respectfully organized, Mrs. Lark with a voice that had steadied into allyship. The press, the small local kind that prints more idealism than circulation, waited for small drama. Elias felt like a man about to read a small sermon. He had learned to speak in the kitchen, and now he must speak in a chamber that measured words by minutes. He took the stand and the air thinned into attention. He did not begin with law. He began with an ordinary thing, his rosemary. He described, in the simple terms of memory, how Margaret had kept a sprig on the sill, how she would break a leaf between thumb and finger and let him smell of it to remember home. He spoke of the way Hob had arrived in a parcel, how the shelter had labeled him with a small brutal word, and how the cat had become a domestic instrument against solitude. He told them of nights when Hob had warmed his legs and of mornings when the cat's patient gaze had saved him from the pressure of an empty chair. "You can take a cat as an asset," Elias said, voice steadying with every sentence. "But you cannot take away the way it made someone mend." He paused, allowing the sentence to settle like a stone in still water. He did not denounce law. He asked law to remember its purpose, to protect people's right to keep what their hearts trusted and their deeds attested. Pembroke's counsel countered with the practiced logic of stewardship and the precedents of municipal procedure. He spoke of asset management and the good that could come from standardized housing programs. He was not unkind. He was simply certain. He offered charts and precedents, an array of administrative neatness, yet then the children spoke. Mr. Delaney brought forth small witnesses, voices that do not fear the sentimental truth. "Hob saved my Daisy from being afraid of the dark," a child said with the plain earnestness of a cathedral bell. "He slept by me when I was sick," another added. Their words were not formal evidence in the technical sense, but in the moral ledger they were vital. The mayor, who had been expected to be neutral, found himself leaning forward as he listened to the small voices that measure the town's soul. Pembroke, seeing his rhetoric blunted by the hunger of neighbor testimony, changed tactics. He appealed to a higher kindness, offering a promise. Pembroke and Cubbers would ensure Hob's care in a facility that boasted veterinary attention and rehabilitation programs. "We are not enemies of tenderness," he said smoothly. "We simply have the means and systems to care for such animals at scale." There was an ugliness to the appeal, the polished tenor of a man who meant the world's well for some parts of it and assumed others were expendable. Elias felt anger rise like a fault in the earth. But then Hob did something that had become his particular gentle law. He jumped from Elias's lap and walked to the center of the chamber. He stood between men with files and the people who had come to testify. He blinked once, slowly, and then wound himself around the leg of a council member who had not expected to be owned by affection. It was the simplest act and the most persuasive. A creature could not be an account when it demonstrated belonging like that. The room hummed with an acoustic that the charts could not map. The mayor's hand, trembling in the public way of someone who knows he will be judged by history and neighbors alike, reached for his pen and turned to the clerk's notes. Evidence, in the end, made the argument plain. Margaret's bequest was authenticated. The solicitor's stamp affirmed the intent. The shelter's intake papers showed chain of custody that supported Elias's claim as foster guardian who had been designated to keep Hob. Pembroke's claim, while not entirely baseless in older municipal assignments, had been rendered shaky by lack of continued management and by the moral force of neighbor testimony. The council, balancing legality and communal warmth, chose a course that surprised no one who had been listening with their hearts. They pronounced Hob to be in Elias's care, with conditions to ensure veterinary support and registration formalities completed. The decision was, in its small way, a reform. The mayor, in his concluding remarks, spoke not of victors but of responsibilities. He declared that the case had revealed the need for clearer municipal records and for processes that remember living beings are not ledger entries. He proposed a small committee to review property claims made on living creatures and to ensure public notice and neighbor testimony be weighted more heavily in future. Pembroke, cool as ever, accepted the ruling with the grace of a man who can afford magnanimity and made vague promises about contributing to rehabilitation funds. As the chamber emptied, neighbors gathered outside in a rain-washed hush that now felt like relief rather than grief. People patted Elias's back, shook Jonah's hand. Some wiped their eyes. The shelter volunteers clustered, exchanging looks that contained both apology and pride. Mrs. Lark, who had once written complaint, now embraced Elias with a hug that was awkward and genuine. In that clasp there was the sound of community stitched. Elias, who had felt his courage gather like a slow tide, returned home with Hob held high, as if a small standard had been raised. The rosemary's scent welcomed them, as if the plant had been holding its breath during the hearing and was glad to exhale now. The ivy's tendrils brushed the sill as if to welcome them back. The house, which had been a theater of anxiety, softened into the ordinary music of kettles and small chores. There were loose ends yet to be tidied. The municipal committee would need to write new protocols. Pembroke and co-sires would likely press for clearer, legally binding assignments in other cases. The shelter promised internal reforms. But the most pressing recompense was simple. Hob remained in his accustomed place at the foot of Elias's chair, and the town had been reminded that life is measured in the small attentions that make a house into a home. In the days after the hearing, Elias found himself changed by a subtle alchemy. Where once he had tended the rosemary because habit demanded keeping, now he tended it because he knew how much small rituals mattered to a community. He walked more, in the lane, greeting neighbors with a confidence that was not new but was rather recovered. Jonah visited more often. The son and father exchanged reparations that were mostly words made practical, lunches shared, the swapping of small tasks, a willingness to be present. Hob, for his part, returned to his dignified idleness as if nothing monumental had occurred. He climbed the chair and slept. He leapt to catch a sparrow's reflection in the window, and he watched the town's comings and goings with an ancient patience. Yet there were signs of small gratitude. He would place his head on Elias's knee in the mornings, a corporeal benediction. He would nudge the rosemary pot as if to ensure it was still there, and on the anniversary of the day he had first been left at the shelter's gate, he brushed past the old envelope that had been pinned above the mantel and purred in a manner that sounded, to Elias's ears, like approval. Payoffs returned in little ways. The young volunteer, Susan, received a commendation at the shelter for her subsequent work to amend intake procedures. She later wrote to Elias a small note of thanks that he kept beside the rosemary. The solicitor, Mrs. Brandt, drafted a model clause for local wills that explicitly addressed animals, encouraging bequests that prevented municipal ambiguity. The mayor's committee met and suggested placing a community liaison officer in the shelter to ensure neighbor testimony is quick to be heard. These were small reforms, the kind that hardly make headlines but which change how a town breathes. the more intimate payoffs were tenderer. Jonah and Elias settled into a kind of mutual repair. They ate at the kitchen table more often, spoke of small griefs, and worked on the cottage garden together. Jonah taught Elias to use a phone that could send pictures, and Elias taught Jonah how to harvest rosemary stems without breaking the plant's heart. The son, who had once been a blurred figure in the house's margins, became a steady presence, helping with Hobbs' vet visits and sometimes sitting late, sharing bread and silence. In his heart, Elias felt the peculiar astonishment of being needed again and being ready to answer. He had been a man who kept his grief tidy. Now grief kept him honest. The cat had not cured him. No animal can be a cure. But Hobbs' quiet companionship had been the impetus for change. It taught him to act publicly for what he loved privately. It taught the town something else, that the smallest beings often measure out the largest truths. When the ivy finally tufted the sill's chipped paint, it seemed less like an invasion and more like a flowered witness to the place's endurance. There were moments, light and brief, which felt like a poem. Hob watched from the window as snow smudged the lane white. A child from 2 houses down, who had once been afraid of thunder, knocked and asked to see him. Elias made cocoa, and the cat lay with the child until sleep arrived. The town that had once debated him from council rooms now found itself aligned along porches, noticing small kindnesses more readily. In quieter ways, the world had shifted. Elias kept the yellowed receipt and the brittle will in a drawer he opened with care. He would sometimes take them out and smooth the edges with a thumb as if touching scripture. In private, he thanked Margaret with a mouthful of words to the rising steam of the kettle. At night, the rosemary scent comforted him like a memory's warm hand. He had lost much and yet had been given a thin, extraordinary gift, the chance to be remade by tender insistence. The changes that began in his house rippled outward in modest waves. A neighbor started a small initiative to encourage registration of animals with more neighborly notice. The shelter revised its intake forms to require a brief outreach to a local lane or parish before any collection is attempted. Pembroke & Co., chastened by the publicity, proposed a modest partnership with the community to fund rehabilitation programs, an offer received with wary civility and the recognition that large institutions can be taught by small towns how to be tenderer. In the end, what stayed with Elias was not a legal victory, but the way ordinary faces had refused to look away. Mrs. Lark's note of apology, the teacher's children's drawings, the shelter volunteers' steadying presence, all of these became tokens in a small altar of gratitude. The rosemary continued to scent the mornings, and the ivy, which had once crept as if to claim bricks, now leaned as if in fellowship. One evening, months after the hearing, Elias walked the lane with Hob at his side. The sky held the kind of dusk that keeps secrets well, and the town looked like the ordered map of a life one had been allowed to keep. He paused at the shelter's gate, and Susan waved. They exchanged a nod that contained more than words, a consensus born of shared action. He walked home with the cat, who was no longer a problem but a parish truth. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? The people of Elias's town would say, in a chorus of small voices, that sometimes the softest things teach the hardest lessons. Hob had taught them to be public where they might have been private, to be brave where they might have been polite, and to remember that law, when it forgets its heart, must be reminded by the simple motions of neighborly will. As the lane settled into night and the rosemary caught the moonlight like a handful of small stars, Elias opened his door to a house that now hummed with company. Hob leapt to his favorite spot by the hearth and curled into a tight, sure knot. Elias sat, hands folded, and watched the cat sleep as if reading a book that had the single sentence all men must learn. To keep what one loves, one must be willing to stand in its defense. Outside, the town's lights blinked like private beacons. Inside, small breaths synchronized. The falling action, the aftermath of the storm, had given them more than quiet. It had given them a new grammar for living together. The question was no longer whether law or kindness would prevail. It was how both could be taught again to remember the small things that make a house a home. Night laid itself thin across the town like a careful hand-smoothing cloth, and in Elias's kitchen the lamplight trembled with the long patience of small things. Hob slept with the old courage of animals who have been moved more than once yet know how to settle. His breath was a metronome for the house's slow repair. The council's papers had been read, the mayor had spoken, Pembroke had retreated with polite promises, and the town had learned a lesson that smelled faintly of rosemary and oven heat. There remained, however, a quiet that had not yet been named, the uneasy silence of aftermath, where victory is both balm and instruction, and where new obligations hide inside the shape of relief. Elias, who had learned the economy of small kindnesses by heart, sat with the brittle will and the yellowed receipt like relics, and wondered which future they would buy. Around him the neighborhood hummed with ordinary business, but there are reckonings that no one's daily errands can wholly dismiss. The cat's paw moved once, a small punctuation. The ivy pressed toward the sill as if to listen. What comes after a saved thing, and who tends the tending? Now when storms break, they leave behind both mud and clarity. The hearing had been a storm and its verdict a clearing. Now the town had to walk the lanes with the new light. For Elias, the day after the council's ruling was not triumphant in any loud way. There were no banners, no brass bands. Rather, there were postmarks of small changes. Hobbs' registration certificate in a neat envelope, a letter from the shelter with the director's carefully penned apology, and a pledge to improve intake communication, a printed notice from the mayor announcing the new committee to review municipal claims on living creatures. These were modest miracles. The city's large machinery had been nudged by neighborhood voices, and that nudge would, in time, become policy. You cannot always change the shape of a river, but you can build a little bridge across it and teach others where to cross. Elias kept himself to small rhythms because habit had taught him that small rhythms beat out grief better than grand gestures. He rose with the sun, and the rosemary took his hand like a friend reminding him of promise. Hobb resumed the work of being a cat in a town that was still learning to treat cats as more than ledger entries. He sat at the window in the mornings and watched the lane like an old magistrate, not judging so much as taking inventory of the world's small acts. Children continued to come. The teacher led a new lesson about civic care that used Hobb as example rather than spectacle. The shelter instituted a brief outreach procedure. Before any collection of animals from a neighborhood, they would now do a 1-week canvass, talk to neighbors, and post visible notices. It was a small civic virtue, but virtues are often small. People noticed different things now. Mrs. Lark, who had drawn the first complaint, began baking 3 loaves on Saturdays, one to leave at Elias's gate. She would not say openly she'd made amends. She was too owned to apologize extravagantly, but when she left the loaf and retreated, there was a fortification of goodwill that came from doing more than writing. Jonah, for his part, stayed. The city had taught him speed and negotiation. The lane taught him patience. He found again what had once been his father's, the capacity to sit with silence and not be obliged to fill it. He taught Elias, with an awkward patience, to use the phone that could send pictures to distant friends. In return, Elias taught Jonah how to slice rosemary without bruising the plant, a small domestic lesson that smelled like civility. Pembroke & Co., sensing the town had heard itself speak, repositioned their public face. They set up a small fund for rehabilitation and offered to collaborate on shelter improvements. They would not yield authority holding to them too tightly, but they did begin, slowly, to appear at the more visible edges of civic projects. Some people accepted the partnership warily. Others welcomed the money with the caution of those who know that generosity wrapped in ledger paper sometimes has strings. Pembroke's executives came to one local meeting and listened, and for a few hours the men who once navigated the town by private maps encountered a public that would not be sidelined. It was not a conversion of spirits, but a negotiation of behavior, and small negotiations sometimes make large history. At home, the plants kept their promises. The rosemary grew greener as if approval were sunlight. Elias pruned it with the thin, satisfied concentration of one who is a craftsman of small things. The ivy, which had once crept like a polite invasion across the sill, thickened into a curtain that softened the window's edges. Those plants, woven into the house's seam, were not proof of legal victory but tokens of endurance, living witnesses that the place had been kept with intention. The plants paid back what they had been given, scent that summoned memory and green that claimed the room for life rather than bereavement. Neighbors told quiet stories that became town lore. The bakery's apprentice spoke in a corner of the market about the widowed shopkeeper who had found Hobb at her doorstep, and in the cat's calm had discovered the courage to go outside again. The teacher painted Hobb as a character in a class play about civic responsibility, and children recited lines about listening to older neighbors and caring for the small creatures among them. These recitations were not high theology. They were civic education with fur and whiskers attached, and they spread through the town like slow, good gossip. Time, which patches many things, also brought anniversaries. The day Hob had first been left at the shelter, the day that had nearly been the end of the story, was marked a year later by a modest celebration led by the shelter and the town. It was a garden party more than a rally. Cakes iced with rosemary sprigs, simple speeches, and a bench that bore the inscription, "In memory of those who care for the small and the quiet." The mayor, flush with the taste of good publicity and moved perhaps by the sight of children clambering at the cat's feet, offered a short remark about civic duty and neighborliness. Pembroke sent a donation towards veterinary care for disabled animals as a public gesture. Some applauded him. Others watched to see what his next move would be. Hob, for his part, allowed himself to be fussed with gentle hands and then retreated to a quiet corner to lick his paws. Entirely unconcerned with the gravity humans chose to project upon his life, Elias walked to that party with Jonah and with Susan from the shelter at his side like three people who had come through the same small war and were now learning how to live anew. The townspeople came and the children placed daisies in a small pot beneath the newly named bench. Hob paraded like the monarch of little kingdoms, accepting a child's crown of paper without much dignity, and then slinking away to a sunlit patch. Those moments were evidence that a town's life had been reordered not by a single judgment, but by the ongoing practice of neighborly care. Private gifts appeared too. The shelter found funds to fit Hob with a more comfortable brace. A local craftsperson made him a small padded ramp to aid his leap onto the chair he favored. Jonah, spruced by the city's practical logic, installed a small shelf by the window to make Hob's climbs easier. These acts were not theatrical. They were the quiet mechanics of living. They made the house safer and the cat's days calmer. In such details, the small gifts of many hands created a better life for one creature and a clearer conscience for a town. Then, months after the hearing and after the bench and the sausages and the gentle public amendments, there came an afternoon of the kind that makes memory lean forward. A late sun that softened everything into gold, a breeze that carried the smell of thyme and bread. Elias was pruning the rosemary, a gentle action, and Hob, who liked to patrol the garden in the afternoons, began to paw at the soil near the base of the plant. He pawed with an energy different from his usual measured inspection. There was a purpose to his digging that surprised Elias. Hob worked his forepaws with patient insistence and then, with a small, dignified flourish, dislodged a tin can wrapped in oilcloth. Elias knelt down, hands steady though his chest fluttered with an odd pressure of anticipation. He recognized the movement of Hob's paws as if it had a grammar. He unwrapped the oilcloth and found, tucked into the tin, a small bundle of papers, letters and a scrap of cloth. The handwriting on the topmost page was unmistakable, Margaret's looping script, softened by time but patient. Elias's thumb trembled as he read the first line, which began as if it had been waiting for him. If one day you find the rosemary too poor a witness, open this and remember the promise. It was not, strictly speaking, a legal document. It was a series of small, ordinary letters Margaret had written in the quiet of late afternoons when the kettle sang and the house felt empty. She had hidden them in the tin beneath the rosemary, a place she trusted because it was tended and near the window where light came in. In the letters she wrote things that were not grand, admonitions about not forgetting the salt jar, recipes for a broth that would make anyone feel like they were loved, and more tenderly a paragraph about the cat. She had written of Hob with the affection that is the measure of small souls. Keep him, she had written, because some things are not property, but promises. She had asked Elias if he ever felt the world lean him toward letting go, to recall why small bequests matter. She had ended with a line almost like a benediction. If I go before you, let the rosemary remember me and the cat keep you from being alone. Elias sat back on his heels and felt the world align in a small axis. Tears came, gentle and unashamed, as if the house itself had been weeping with him for a season and now let him know it was whole. Hob hopped onto his lap and nudged his chin into Elias's palm, as if to press the case that some sentences, however late, can alter the weight of a life. It was as though Margaret had known the town would send men with forms and that, as always, The small things would be what saved them. The discovery of the letters changed the tenor of every conversation thereafter. They were not needed to prove legal ownership. The will had done that. But they were a moral codicil that stitched the community's memory into a personal testimony. The volunteer from the shelter who had first lifted the parcel read the letters aloud one evening to a group of neighbors in Elias's kitchen, the room warm with soup and rosemary and the soft glow of lamps. They listened as if a small gospel had been found. In that reading, the town learned not only how to legislate better, but why one must, to protect the fragile acts of tenderness that often do not legislate themselves. More practical reforms followed in time. The mayor's committee produced a short ordinance requiring public notice and neighbor testimony before any municipal claim to living creatures could be actioned. The shelter received a modest grant to hire a liaison officer to improve communications. Pembroke and Cobers signed a memorandum with the shelter to fund rehabilitation and to allocate a portion of their work to community projects that improved record-keeping. These were bureaucratic things and therefore slow, but the slow tends to stay if it is done well. The most tender payoff, though, was not legislative but interior. Elias's house changed its atmosphere from the quiet of loss to the hush of occupied life. He slept better. His steps were less measured by memory and more by present steps. He and Jonah mended small fissures between them. Dinners, a few visits to the market, and the occasional shared silence that used to be too heavy, but now sat like a friend. Jonah brought friends by to meet the cat and discovered in the lane an unexpected human geography. People who are easily hurried by careers, but who will stand and fight for what they love. As for Hob, time taught him what it teaches all living things, that days are less than the urge to be present. He aged as cats do, not in theatrical decline, but like the slow dimming of a good light. His limp remained, and his night leaps grew smaller. Yet his gifts multiplied. He became to many the town's small conscience. If someone returned late and sat uncertain on a step, Hob would go and sit with them. If a child came home from a quarrel, Hob would make the right kind of sound, that low conservation of certainty, and the child would unclench. He performed 1,000 tiny mercies, not by instruction but by inclination. There came an evening some years later when the lane held a hush like a funeral for something not quite gone. Hob, curled in his chair by the hearth, had the weathered look of a being close to a horizon. Elias sat beside him, palm upon fur, and understood in a bone-deep way that there are moments to let go and moments to remain. He had been given the choice before. Now he must be given the courage to be generous again. Hob's breaths were soft and slow. The rosemary in the windowsill seemed to hold its scent in little beads like prayer. Hob lifted his head and, with that small cat clarity he had always had, walked from Elias's lap to the edge of the hearth and then to the door. Elias, trusting the small denominations of the animal's gestures, rose and followed with the steadiness of practice. Hob moved slowly to the threshold and stopped, looking back at Elias with those eyes that had taught a town to be tender. He nudged the elderly man's hand with a paw, as one might offer thanks, and then padded to the window where the ivy had finally braided itself into a lush curtain. He went to the sill, and there he sat like a small satisfied judge. He looked out at the lane that had once been the arena of his fate, and then, with a very quiet motion, he turned to Elias and rubbed his forehead against his knee. It was an old benediction, brief and incandescent, the sort of acceptance that gives one permission to grieve at last and to say yes to the next act of life. Elias understood. He rested his forehead upon the cat's head, a simple human act that contained more theology than sermon. Hob's final act was not dramatic. He did not die with a fanfare. He slept and then simply did not wake for the next small breath. The cat went out as cats do, by making his departure ordinary without advertisement, so that those who loved him could fill the silence with memory rather than spectacle. There was grief, of course. A house without a small purring compass is altered in a way strangers cannot easily understand, but there was also the sense of completion that comes from a life well used. Elias sat with him through the night, hands folded, the rosemary perfuming the room like a private liturgy. The town mourned in its own way. People came by with loaves and notes in the neighborly quiet that asks nothing of a grieving man other than presence. Jonah built a small box with the carefulness of a carpenter and hollowed it for Hob's belongings. A tuft of fur, the paper-rolled receipt from the shelter, Margaret's small letter from the tin, and a sprig of rosemary. They buried Hob beneath the rosemary plant in the garden, not as property interred, but as a good citizen of the house laid to rest. The bench in the park acquired another small plate. For Hob, keeper of doors, patience of lanes. In the months after, Elias would sometimes walk to that rosemary and sit where Hob had sat, feeling the small cold of earth where something dear now lay. He would speak aloud to no one in particular, telling the plant small domestic confessions. How are the children? Did Mrs. Lark's son come back? The rosemary answered in scent and growth. That plant had kept a secret and released it when the time was right. It had been a witness and an accomplice. Its payoff was complete. It had held the tin of letters. It had perfumed the kitchen when Hob died, and it had become, in the local lore, the herb that remembers. The last residue of the contest was not triumph nor defeat. It was education. The ordinance changed how paperwork was kept. The shelter's liaison found herself drafting pamphlets. Pembroke & Co. contributed to a small fund that helped other disabled animals be fitted with braces and ramps. The town learned a law that was older than statute. That which is kept together by love deserves protection. That law is not found in statute books but in porches and the names pinned to small benches. The world has a plurality of accounts, some are monetary, many are moral. In Elias's lane, the moral account had gained credit. In the final reckoning, Elias sat in his kitchen years later with a cup of tea and a small, clean piece. He had been adjusted by sorrow and by care. He read Margaret's letters sometimes, smoothing the edges with a thumb and finding in them directives for ordinary days. Jonah came by with news of the city but stayed for bread. The plants were thriving. Rosemary robust, ivy tamed into a graceful curtain. And the house no longer felt like a museum of grief, but like a lived place where small mercies were practiced daily. Sometimes in late afternoons that smelled of bread and wood smoke, Elias would feel a presence in the room and a warmth at his feet where Hob used to be. It was memory, a tender, living memory that does not pretend to replace what was lost but that rather keeps it bright. Kipling wrote in his own fashion that a man's goodness is tested by the small things he keeps without ceremony. In this lane, men and a cat had shown how that goodness might be rescued from ledger and law. The universal truth that the town learned, as old as hearth and as new as the law they would write, was simple. Communities are measured by the care they afford their weakest and their quietest. If a place will not keep its small creatures, it has surrendered part of its soul. But if it does, it can become like the rosemary's scent, a guiding thing that anchors days. Hob's story remained in the town not only as the tale of a saved cat, but as a parable about the obligations neighbors hold to one another. Children grew up in the lane with a bench and a tale to tell, that an old man and a disabled cat had stood before lawyers and men with files and had insisted on the proper weight of mercy. They learned to put up notices and to talk to each other rather than to file complaints first. They learned that paper must sometimes be soft to preserve the living. Years later, when people came to the lane and asked the way to the bench, they would be given an address and told the story as if it were a history and a ritual. The town had built no monument of marble but had instead improved its ways. That was the monument that mattered. Elias's hand grew wrinkled and slow, but his eyes kept their steady, kindly light. In his last years, he would sit by the window and tell stories to neighborhood children about the day the town learned to listen. He made sure to teach them the small details: how to prune rosemary without shocking the plant, how to register an animal and still keep the neighbor consulted, how to look at a person who appears to be a problem and find, instead, a life worth saving. When Elias died, the town who had once stood with him came together again. They did not rehearse the courtroom scenes nor invite Pembroke's counsel to retell their arguments. They came with bread and rosemary and with a silence that honored the slow work of the ordinary. Jonah, older and steadier, read Margaret's letters aloud at the small service beside the bench. Children scattered rosemary leaves over the grave, and the mayor, without pomp, declared a day of small civic service to clean the shelter and plant herbs for those who kept houses like temples of small mercies. Hob had given them a gift that was not wrapped in paper, but in habit. He had taught them to tend, and tending is a skill that makes a life hospitable to grief and gratitude both. The last gift was not an easier life but an honest one. The knowledge that they had been capable of responding when called upon. That knowledge kept them like a warm hearth through winters and disputes to come. The story ends then with a small and fierce tenderness. Hobbs' passing closed a loop, abandoned to the shelter, nearly taken by municipal machinery, kept by a man who listened, and a town that finally learned to speak for itself. The plants had kept their promise. The shelter had reformed its ways. Pembroke's promise had been redirected into care, and Elias had been given again the reason to wake. The moral, gentle and unrelenting, is that lives are preserved one neighbor at a time, and that the ordinary courage of standing up for a single, small thing can alter a town's pulse. You stayed with me till the very end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.